All right, let's continue this mini-series on cityscapes, and with particular focus on creating cityscapes that are partly rendered in 3D and somewhat also post-edited. And here is sort of the idea of what we're exploring. The idea is to add a nice texture that could be something like windows, balconies, whatever it is. It could be something that doesn't even have any sort of, maybe it's just a pattern of some sort, a brick pattern, but you want it to be perspective warped into that outline of the 3D rendered wall. So it's taking a look at some of the techniques. I'll be frank with you, it's not perfect in all ways. Ideally, we would simply click on this wall and it would fill it right there with the perspective projection. In fact, ideally, we wouldn't even have to do that in post work. We would be texture mapping those things, but that's not what we do yet. So at this time, there are some texture capabilities in the Puppy Ray renderer, but they are volumetric textures and they are not controllable to be repetitive over a particular wall and not show up on other parts like on the floor or on the ceilings or on other walls. So that's not the approach we're going to use. What we're going to explore is either painting directly on that or actually placing some patterns into the right position and mapping them on there in a post stamping approach, so to speak, or filling it in with the fill tools. There are a couple of other ways to do things with this. We've seen in the past something like the cityscapes that we build out of brushes with custom brushes, possibly even animated brushes. Something like a single image photograph where we isolate a portion, and there's plenty of office space with some of these windows partly closed, partly opened. There's some reflections, probably some need to do some adjustments on contrast or saturation. Whatever these textures are, you're going to want to map them into the into these walls, right, of your buildings. And these are not very tall buildings, but you get the idea. The basic purpose here is to have some sort of a texture. Like, for instance, this mostly white wall here on the right side, or this bluish one with the reflections, to have that mapped onto the side walls of these 3D blocks. Another thing we did is we put these into custom brushes and a whole sequence of them. So then we were able to simply paint and plaster these multiple images into the background. So that's one way to create cityscapes, perhaps from real photography, from real buildings that we prepare and isolate the details from which we want to go. And then you can paint and dabble it in different places and do some more post work on that. So we have a challenge to combine some of these textures, especially when we have them in nice face-on view. We have a challenge to place that into the 3D walls, right? And perhaps we can use it not for just one scene, but again to create something a bit more 3D with a bit of lighting, shading, ambient occlusion, soft shadows, and so on, and a few more levels of realism to build another image into a custom brush that you then can paint in a way similar to this here, with some further realism added to it. By the way, if you're not into building this yourself, if you just want to create your own scene, but you want to use existing elements, 3D elements, image-based elements, there are a number of places to find that. And I'd like to give a quick shout out for DAZ, the Digital Art Zone, maker of Carrara and other great tools, and also maker of, or publisher of, scenery content, and of course character, 3D characters, humanoids, animals, everything. And there is a collection of cityscapes that you will see, some of them from a stonemason, and some of them are really just awesome. And why waste your time reinventing the wheel? Sometimes you have what you're looking for right here. If you can get a license for inclusion in your games, for instance, you'll want to negotiate that with them. But the idea is that you don't necessarily have to reinvent the wheel if somebody else has already created a very nicely lubricated wheel that works so much better. So you might want to take a look at that as well. Das3D.com. Some of them are, look very sophisticated, but it's just a photograph. It's a single image, and it's plastered on a single polygon, sort of a flat rectangular area that simply carries that image. And you see here a side view. It's flat, but when you look at it from the lower left side and facing it, it gets reflected, it gets all sorts of extra visual realism, and it's good enough for what you needed. So again, we're going to explore some of the techniques. It's not the only way to get to the same result. So let's see, what are the result is essentially a polygon. I'm going to go with something really starter level here, right? First of all, we have a very simple block. In fact, usually when you erase it, it starts white and you have a black color for the background. Simply use the fill tool for the rectangle mode. So there is a rectangle hollow upper left corner of this icon in the toolbar, and then the lower right corner of this gets you to filled mode for the rectangle fill. And so with that, it fills it. Now you see it's not filling it in just plain color. I already switched in the past to a texture, and so to show you what it really usually will show is if you look for the fill settings, it's here somewhere. With the fill settings, there it is. You can access that in most tools. All tools that have the fill mode as an option will have the fill settings show in the context bar. And if you can't find it, you can always go to the view menu and look for the fill settings there as well. All right, so here's the fill settings, and that panel has 3 different ways to fill something. Right, a region, an outline can be filled with a plain color, and then you got to choose the color, and that's something you do here. For instance, green, pink, whatever. Then you have the pattern fill. That's this one here, and so now here you see a preview of the pattern. You can click it to see it tiled, and it's just a rectangular tile. You can also have it warped, and you see in the preview perhaps some sort of a warping inside a spherical outline or circular outline with anti-aliasing perhaps. And so that's getting more interesting, but it's probably not exactly what we need. So that's one mode. There's also the horizontal. That's a gradient. So if you have a gradient of some sort, let's say something like this here, something like that, maybe even with color changes, a little bit of green, a little bit of blue, and why not a little bit of red. There you go. And then smooth it. Okay, so that gradient can be also used in a fill, horizontal fill gradient. Let's say if you use the fill tool that way, the entire area gets this fill. If you use the rectangular tool, it fills the rectangle that way. Now it's probably not fully opaque, which is why it's combining multiple filled objects here. So you might want to check the opacity. That one's there. Maybe it's the mode. No, let's make sure it's replace mode. It might have some other. There is a multiply mode there. Okay, replace. There you go. So now we have the polygons, the rectangles actually replacing everything with the gradient, mind you. Right. So you have vertical gradients, you have circular gradients, you have a couple of different ways. Warped mode. You have the contour. That's the new one in version 11, and we're going back now to the pattern fill. Right. So with the pattern fill, you see that the pattern is really omnipresent, and you can fill a portion of it. Let's go and clear all this, clear the selection, erase. And so when you fill this, what we'd like to do is really have it filled into an image like this, just this portion. Right, so now that's going to be tough. You can't just go here and have it automatically find the edges to fill there. Maybe someday, right? Maybe sort of a warp fill capability, perspective corrected warp fill, so that you could just click here and it would fill it here. and then click here and it would fill it here. Right now it doesn't do that. If you use the fill tool and click here, it fills it, but it's not warping it in that perspective, distortion or adjusting, right? So it's just a rectangular tile. And you can do it here too, and plus it bleeds, depending on how much tolerance you give it. You might have too little for some areas, too much for some other areas. So you can perhaps fix it in some ways, but it's not going to be perfect. Plus you see how it's losing that shading, the darkness. We need a way to make this, keep it darker here. So when we click it, maybe we can do a interactive undo that will show some of the texture, but still it's not perspective warped. What we need really is to find a way to fill that entire rectangle into just this rectangle, this quad four-sided polygon with perspective alignment. And so let's take a look at how to do that. I'm gonna go and let's see, how do we want to best do that? You know, essentially what we want to do is achieve something like this, right? Or then when we combine it to have that, we have this, we have that, we have combined it together. In fact, if you put, let's say we put this one in an upper layer, let's add a layer here, right? And select the lower layer, put the original image, and then select the upper layer, and then put this there. There. That basically sums it up. This layer here at the top is fully opaque, but it's combined. It's being blended in with a multiply mode, right? Now you could also do some other modes. You could see what happens if you do something like screen mode. Nope, that's ugly. You could do subtractive. You could do additive. You could do divide. So each of these might have something usable or not, and you might want to explore that. But most of the time, I think multiply is going to do it just fine here. Multiply essentially says that if your texture is white, like this one here, the white background, it's really not the background, it's just the area around the polygon of interest. That white area is being multiplied to the pixels of the layer below, and so that basically means it's not modifying it, right? You take white and you multiply it with the current color, it remains the current color. So that's why you see it unchanged there. Whether you show that texture, that layer here, if I turn it off, you see a change in this area, but everywhere else it doesn't change because white multiplied to that color still remains the same color. And so now what we want to do is simply decide, well, how do we get that texture squeezed in here? What's the original texture? Well, if we take, for instance, let's say if we go to that layer and erase it, and then we hide this layer, but here we stay at the top layer. If we go and fill in this pattern, right, this fill pattern, we can do so right here, and we make sure we are in pattern fill mode, and just click here. We see that pattern being filled here. Right, where did that pattern come from? Well, in this case, we actually have a choice of a couple of, maybe almost 100 patterns here that are all tileable, repeatable, tileable, and some of them will be really interesting from a point of view of mimicking the presence of windows. Now, some of these will definitely not. There will be more things like rocks and pieces of patches of mud and plaid patterns and stuff like that, riverbeds, tree stumps, but some of them might be kind of suitable for mimicking some windows on or brick patterns there on a wall. Ultimately, what you really need is a picture of what it is you want. If you want glass windows, get a picture of glass windows, paint it or create, or go out, take a picture with your phone or camera, and build up an inventory, perhaps, or at least a sample of a piece of real estate and the windows or the walls that you want to map there. I'm going to go with the brick pattern here. Right, brick pattern. So if I take that, you see the brick pattern here, and so if I erase this and fill it in, you see the brick pattern here. Now you see it semi-translucent because it's being multiplied with the background image, which is currently invisible. So I see the plaid pattern there too. Let me turn this other image back in. In fact, let me erase that image. Right. Oops, no, I'm still erasing. I turned the lower one on, but I'm still focused on the top one. So let me undo that. Then select the lower layer and erase that one. There. Now we have a multiply of the upper layer. the contrast is fairly soft here. I'm going to adjust the contrast here. I'm going to adjust the dynamic range. Now that might be a little bit too harsh, so I'm going to go with the interactive undo to find sort of an interesting middle ground. There you go. All right, let's store this image. You never know, you might need this again. So this is the texture that I want to squeeze into what? Into this one, into these four corners of that wall. And then I might want to do this again on this one and again on this one. But let's see the technique for one wall at a time. So I have this picture and I need to squeeze it into this corners. There is a tool that will do that. Let's take a look at the picture first like this. All right. What I want to do is basically grab this corner and move it somewhere. Grab this corner here in the upper right and move it somewhere else. And do the same with the lower corner, lower right and lower left. All right. So that tool you can find under the filter, transformation, perspective warp. It's not the only one that does something similar to that, but it's by far the best. Right, there is a 3D perspective tool also. You could explore that a little bit. You could say, well, what if I had just a perfect lineup like this? And in fact, I don't want it repeating. Uncheck this so you see it just once. You can tile it until it's disappearing. And you can tile it, move it a little bit. There you go. So you have something kind of, but you see how it's not really meant to be used for that. Plus we need a 2-point perspective. It's not going to cut it. There is another tool also that we've had for a long time, and it's the warp mesh. That tool is kind of interesting too, but it's got too much granularity and it's not perspective correct inside each of those elements. So it makes some funny faces if you have a face in there, but it's not, even if you reduce the granularity down to 2 by 2, it's going to be, you know, bigger pieces, but it's rare. Plus you don't see it in the main view, you just see it here in the preview. Now of course you could adjust that. No, actually this is an old one, you can't. So not the tool to use. What you want to do really is this tool here. Go to the new one, perspective warp. So the perspective warp, I think we introduced in version 9.6 or maybe 10, I forget when, but it's a fairly recent tool. And what that does is a number of things. You can grab it in the middle here and just move this thing around. Now it won't tile. One thing you can also do is you can rotate, you can scale, and most importantly, you can grab these corners and map them somewhere else. Right? So you can create, you know, if you have a clear vision of where these corners need to go, you can do that. But most likely you'll miss what you want. This is what you wanted, right? So how do you make it so that this thing really mapped onto that area? Well, you need this image as a reference. You need the background image like this one here. You need this wall as a reference. You need that to show somewhere. So I would basically put this into a layer, like the upper or the lower layer. It's in multiply mode. You don't even need to adjust, but you could still adjust the transparency level. And then whichever layer you work with, whether it's yet another one above it, or this one here, that one too, you could do perhaps a bit of a reduction in intensity. And so now in this layer is where you're going to fill the pattern. There it is. There's my texture pattern. And what you want to do is now use that warp tool. Right. So let's go with the filter, transform, and perspective warp. And so you grab this upper left corner, and you see how it's doing this same thing in the preview in this preview area here, but it's also showing it immediately in the background in the main view. And so that's really why it's a great value, because now you can line it up. Instead of looking here where my cursor is, as you grab it, start looking over here in the main view, and you have this layer below it or above it showing you where it's going to fit. Now you could actually go exactly to that point, or perhaps a little bit on the inside if you want to have a bit of a margin. And then you go grab the next corner, lower left corner for instance, and place it down about here. Right? And perhaps make sure that you still have that margin showing here, about the same margin all along. And then you grab the other corner in the lower right. Now here's where you may need to move the interface over a little bit. By the way, that interface you can also adjust. So if you need a bit more fine-tuning granularity on that movement, that's certainly a possibility. And then you have the last corner up here in the upper right. And it really doesn't matter in which order you do that. You might do the top first, the bottom, the sides, and get back to them too. If you, oh, and then look at that, I made the mistake. I actually mapped it over two blocks that are side by side. That's okay, we can do that, but maybe that will squeeze or flatten or expand the polygon. So I might want to do that one polygon at a time, one city block wall at a time, and just do this one. All right. Okay. So now maybe this one here I can move up a little bit closer. There you go. So I have this. I'm going to go. Oops, where is it? Somebody calling me. Let's wait for later. Okay. So so here it is. I have the upper layer. I can hide it. There it is. And now one thing you notice is that the background around it here is turning dark. And if I put the opacity back to full, it is because it's black. So it got, obviously it got the black area from one of those. Actually, it's not even one of our primary or secondary colors. So that's probably just the default it picks as the background, and we're going to need to fix that in this layer. Right? Easy enough though, that's probably the only black pixels we have. The texture itself may not have a completely black pixel. And so what we do is we simply fill this black area with white, and the white is the secondary color. Just right click here and it gets filled with white, so it becomes, in a multiply mode, it becomes transparent. So now you can change the opacity all you want. It's still gonna do something. Why is that? Did I not work on the right? Okay, I still have something. Oh, this texture is, wait, which one is it? Did I, oh, I painted it in the wrong place. Okay, well, there's a couple of things that are being combined now. Let me go hide this original. So I have two, I have in this image, I really have the image and the warped copy of it. And I actually probably should have eliminated one. So, oh, I know what it is. I was doing a fill, right? And the fill mode, even though I have a color, it's not actually using the fill mode as the color, it's using the brick mode. Silly me. Okay, so that's because I left it without changing it back. So here's the pattern fill I'm still using, and I didn't really need that because I wasn't doing a fill, I was doing the perspective warp. So I can go back to the plain color, and if I'm in plain color mode, now right clicking will fill to white. Okay, perfect, everything is still good. So now I can go and enable this layer with the original 3D rendering, and we see the two combined. And I could flatten it, or perhaps I want to adjust a little bit on that transparency so it's not quite as intense. But now you can see that the background around it is not being modified. Again, it's a white background color there. So it's only showing changes in colors when I change in this area here where the texture is. All right, so that's basically it. You know, that's the technique you can use with this perspective warp to bring an image into a particular area. Let me just do that one more time on this polygon here. So first of all, I'm going to flatten these two. So there's a couple of ways to do that. Layer down is not what it is, because that would simply move it down or up relative to the other layers. This one here, I could go lower. I could flatten the whole thing really, so let's just do that. Okay, so I have one image. Let's get a snapshot of that. Always good to even save it to disk. And so now I'm going to repeat the whole process here. I want to fill this brick texture here, or maybe a different texture. Let's get, you know, like I did with this one. Let's go and find that fill tool again. Fill settings, and under the patterns, this time let's get one of those. Let's get, well, you know what? Maybe some of the mud. What would be fancy stucco look, or mud walls, or maybe green camouflage, something like that. Let's get one of those leaves patterns. All right. Okay, so what we want to do is fill it in this area. We need to open that layer. Let's go here, add a layer. By the way, if you don't use all this space, you can certainly bring these a little bit closer together. There's only room for so many layers. Let's get that. Let's add this layer, and in this layer that we have selected, we will fill with the fill tool and the fill mode as a pattern fill like this. So we're not in plain color mode anymore, we're in fill mode. And simply click here and it will just fill it all over. Now if it's too big, if you want it smaller, one thing you can do is you can go to the brush. This image is in the brush, it's a custom brush. So what you can do is you can resample it to make it a little bit smaller, maybe half the size or something in between. So now you have a smaller version of it. And if you clear and erase fill, now you have the smaller leaves in there. All right, so that's the texture that we want to, that's the texture right here that we want to warp into this wall. All right, so let's go do that. Again, perhaps we want to reduce the intensity, because if let's do without it. And what you'll notice is that if you take the warp tool, transform, perspective warp, as you squeeze it in, grab this corner, you see how it's black here. It's not putting it in white or something like that. So it's not tiling it. That's certainly what we want. But it's going to be black. So that makes it a bit difficult to see the buildings behind it. Right? See how here we see the building, but if we move it close in, it's a bit difficult to know if we actually are right on the corner or a little bit too far already. And so that's why it would be really useful to bring that transparency a little bit down. So even if it's turning black, it's not really turning completely black. And you'll still have enough opacity and saturation on these leaves to actually see the corner of these leaves where they are here. One thing I would also do perhaps is zoom in a little bit, make it comfortable for you to see this entire area. All right, so let's go and do this transform now. Not puppy ray, what am I doing? Perspective warp, there it is. And grab this corner until you see it appear. There it is, in the upper right corner around here. And drop it pretty much right around here. And there you go. And then do the same thing with the upper left corner until you see it around there. And then the lower right corner. There you go. And then finally the lower left. There you go. All right, so now we have that texture right in there. Let's OK that. And let's see if we bring the opacity back to full. Yes, it's black there indeed. So we need to turn that white if we want to be able to composite that in a multiply mode. Now, that's not the only way to do it, by the way. You could certainly do a multiply. You could do a screen mode. You could do a couple of other modes, right? So if, for instance, if we turn this into screen mode, there, now you see the both. Oh, no, this one's still white, because white with screen, that's non-white. It's still going to be the max intensity. That's where you'll need to experiment a little bit. Multiply is really easy, but you could do others. You could do less than. That's not good because this area is black. That's less than anything else, so it's going to show. You might put a mask there so that it clips it and doesn't even modify it over there. So that's another option too, if you just do a compositing. But here we have two layers we want to flatten together. It's some sort of compositing, but maybe... So what I'll do is I'll simply say, let's use the multiply mode, but simply make this area not black, but make it white. Then that way the color from the layer below it will show, and here this will be multiplied to whatever the color is on that wall, which is white. And in fact, it doesn't have to be white. It could be something different. In fact, you know what? Let's paint something there. Let's do a quick paint here on that wall underneath it. Let's say we had a little happy face or something like that, right? With the regular airbrush, one of the thinner, like airbrush 50, and make it somewhat less opaque. Something like that. So we have some, oh, that's too big. Let's first of all bring it in here a little bit. Let's go and make it even smaller. Size, something like this. Okay. So we did some tagging here, right? We placed a tag there. And we want that entire image to be composited with this other one that we have in this layer. right? So you see how now the multiply is actually going to give us and retain that, but it's going to add those leaves as well, right? So that's the idea. But in order to do that, we need to make sure that the black part here is not going to mess up the background as we composite the two layers. So one way to do that is to create a mask and allow only the inside to be composited, right? And then the other technique would be to say, well, let's leave it white so that compositing it will not modify the color when we composite it by multiply operation on pixels. If one is white, the other pixel is remaining at its color. So what I'll do is simply use the fill tool. The right color, the secondary color is still white. I'll right click here. I'll make sure that I'm actually on that layer. That's important. You want to work on that layer, and then right click on that black background, which will not do much. And why is that now? Tolerance is okay. Fill settings. Okay, I'm doing the fill tool here. I should be maybe I'm not filling in plain color mode. I'm still, let's see, make sure I need to be in plain color mode. I was still in pattern mode, so I need to be in plain color mode, and that's all I need. So right click here, now we've got it. Right, now we have this. You see that in the preview here, and maybe we can show large thumbnails. You see the preview has a white background now. Okay, so now we do have actually that thing composited with the green leaves, but the original image here with the happy face is still showing there as well. All right, and so we could still adjust the multiply level of that green leaves information, that layer here, right, and get it a little bit less intense or more intense, whatever you want. Okay, and then once you're done here, you can flatten the two layers together, and our work is done. All right, so that's one technique you can use. Whatever the picture is, if you have a nice picture of some city blocks glass, or if you have some skyscraper head-on with several balconies or rows, floors, and preferably in about the same aspect ratio. You're going to take that entire image and squeeze it into this quadrilateral polygon with the perspective warp. You want that to be about the same aspect ratio, so you don't get too much further distortion. Now that, if it matters, sometimes in fact it looks even better with the extra distortion, so you get a more narrow set of windows. Last thing I would say is that this is really quite often just the beginning. You might want to add some extra embossing here to give it even more 3D look, some more depth. For instance, one thing I will do is I'll go and let's go into a layer here temporarily, add another layer and put this thing back in. But only for the purpose of quickly and easily selecting the outside level. So you see how it's white on the outside. I'm simply going to use the magic wand on this one, and with the magic wand I can select the outside. And what I want to do, what did I want to do? Oh yeah, I wanted to keep the mask on the inside, so that the inside I can process with some extra embossing and lighting and stuff like that without affecting the outside. So I have a selection on the outside. I'm going to go and clear this image, this layer. I don't want this layer, but I want the mask I generated. I want to go down to this layer in the bottom, and I want the mask to not work on the outside. That's what it's showing me right now. That's what is selected. I want the inside of this brick wall, so I'm going to invert the selection. Right, invert selection, and that's a mask you might need to get back to, so it's important perhaps to store that too. If that fits in your workflow, it's one of the options you have here, store selection. Right, or you can go to the selection menu and say store selection. All right, so you have that just so you can get back to that wall piece here. It's something I would always do, early on in your design. If you think you're going to be working, for instance, here when you look at this wall here, if you think you're going to be working on this patch or on this wall or on this one, isolate them as separate elements, and then, or even all three together if you think you can take shortcuts and work on them together. And then at that point you simply you can store that and easily get back to them. All right, so we have this now. One thing we can do is add some embossing to just that wall without affecting the outside. For instance, we can go to the filter, and then the convolution filter has a color emboss, and you see how look at how much more realistic or depth that gets, right? Another way you could use here is the Stylized lighting tool, and that's going to be awesome. I mean, with that you get a light source that you get to put up here somewhere. You can add a little bit of gloss. You can make the light source more distant or further up or more intense. You can extrude the texture some more. You can even, if there is too much noise, too much little fine detail, you don't care for that, you can decrease the smoothness or increase the smoothness so it drops some of that high filter, high fine detail. You can keep the original coloring or go just to a elevation map kind of or bump map mode. And then you can also change the color of the light source. I mean, if the sky up here is kind of a reddish turquoise, not turquoise, what's that? No, not tourmaline. What's the color here? Anyway, some reddish pink mode or mix. You probably would be better off changing the light color here to something similar, right? Magenta. Trying to remember the name of a rocky region south of Bryce Canyon. Maybe it is tourmaline. No, it's not. Anyway, so here it is with a bit more of the reddish tint, and again with extra something like this. There you go. And if you want to make it look like it's wet, you know, decrease that gloss factor and increase the specular highlight on that. Right, that will often give it a bit more of a wet or metallic appearance. Okay, and okay that. Now clear the selection, and voila, you now have that very intense and very saturated wall on that side of the building, and you can do something similar or totally different on the next one. All right, this tutorial comes to an end at this point. We have, I think, the very building blocks, no pun intended, building details, and of course I didn't show you how I created this wall up first, but perhaps I should have started with that. How do you create this thing here in the first place, you know, from an elevation map like that, of course. So I'm gonna go and just do that as a final statement. You start with a blank. You use the secondary or primary color relatively dark. You can always change it later on. Let's say we have something like this, right? And you use the rectangle fill tool. Then you go to fill something like this, big wall, narrow wall, maybe one at a different angle, something like this. So you have a couple of rectangles like this. Let's go turn it into a grayscale so we can convert it. It doesn't matter which way here. Grayscale, expand dynamic range, so it's from white to black. And that's really our basic element that we take into PuppyRay and transform that. And let's say PuppyRay GPU, for instance. That's from a prior render. Let's go back to a quick preview. Let's see, let's move up a little bit with the right button. There you go. Oh, first of all, let's get rid of the hull texture, so we only see the geometry. But one problem here is that we do have we need to invert it. First we need to enable the sky, but so now we see we need to invert it, right? We have black elements on white background. The white is the highest elevation, which is why we see those black buildings actually coming down as pits, as holes. So we need to actually go the other way. Let's undo that. We need to invert this image. This elevation map needs to be inverted so that these dark building blocks here these rectangle will need to be high elevation or bright. So let's go to image and invert it. There you go. All right, so you got the dark is low elevation, bright is high elevation, and that's where your buildings will stand. Let's go and put it over there. We don't need this little side tool, sidebar. There you go. Let's go and render that in PuppyRay. And you can use the CPU version for that. This is not a very sophisticated rendering. You can preview that. You can navigate through that and find the layout you want for your, let's say with the global illumination. You can change the angle, all that sort. But the reason why I like to recommend the GPU version for that is that if you decide to go back later and re-render it, but with water enabled or with bump maps enabled or the visible sun and so on, there's so many things that can be done on the GPU version that you cannot do on the CPU version. So I would recommend, if you have the ability to do so, do that here now, so that you have the city blocks and you can get back to it for more rendering. So let's say we do this, right? I'm going to move the sun a little bit further. Something like this. If you look up a little bit, you might even see it. Yep, there she is. And let's see, position ourselves a little bit to the side. So here's a good one, right? Let's zoom, let's move down a little bit. Let's do something like that. Oh, here's a beautiful wall right here on the right side. Let's say we want to have that brick texture on that, or glass texture, or whatever it is, right? So I'm gonna leave it with that, probably just about here, right? And let's say the sun we want a little bit larger. Let's do 200, 222. That's a big sun. Let's move it down a little bit, so we don't actually see the shadows cast. Well, maybe you want them, maybe you don't. I'll do without. You can adjust the brightness of the illumination here. Maybe we need the sky to be something not so reddish. There you go. Yeah, and then do a final render, or even just a high quality render. That's good enough. Multiple passes. If you want to lose some of that graininess here, what you do is you just increase the anti-aliasing steps. Right, you don't need to increase much more here on the shadow quality or on the fog or some other, like the ray steps. That will just show you more fine details, which is important if you do add some bump. If you add the bump, let's say rocky bumps, you might not see them too well if you enable the if you don't actually allow to see it. If your ray steps is too low, if you set it up to, like, I mean too high, if you have it at 0.004, if you put it at 0.002, then there's a better chance for you to actually see that fine detail of the rocks. But you can only barely see it here because it's kind of far away, and you might need to increase the frequency or the value, the intensity, and that sort of things. Anyway, I think we're pretty much done here. I'm going to go just do a final render here with 30 or so passes, and that's what's happening right now. So thanks for watching. We'll get back with some more ideas. I would encourage you to practice this a little bit. This tool is going to be, I think this perspective warp tool is going to be very key part of your tool set if you want to build these kinds of scenarios with buildings, not like these where they're all at the same height. Of course, you'll have scenarios initially that are easy like this, but then over time you'll do more and more. But one thing that you'll notice also is that you have some shading here, right? It's not all the same lighting, and that's that ambient occlusion, or the indirect lighting that you get from a wall reflecting to another wall, and then not doing that here because it's darker, less of the skylight going into that, and that's all helping. And when you create that brick wall and map it on there with the perspective warp, put it in there in a multiply mode, it's going to keep some of that shading, and that's going to make it just so much more dramatic, so much better looking. All right, well, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.